Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Goddard, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to this Institute lecture. At the end of the lecture, there'll be an opportunity for questions, followed by a reception in Ford Hall, to which you're all welcome. Today, our speaker is Angelos Chaniotis, who joined us this year as a professor in our School of Historical Studies. Angelos' research covers a wide range of aspects of ancient history: the social, cultural, religious, legal, and economic history of the Hellenistic world and the Roman East. He took his bachelor's degree from the University of Athens and his doctorate in ancient history from the University of Heidelberg in 1984. After further research and study in Bonn and Heidelberg, he taught ancient history at Heidelberg from 1987 to 1994, when he moved to New York University as associate professor and then professor of Greek history. In 1998, he returned to Heidelberg as professor of ancient history, also serving as vice rector of the university with responsibility for international relations from the year 2001. In 2006, he moved to All Souls College, Oxford, as senior research fellow, and from there he joined the faculty of the Institute at the beginning of this academic year. Angelos' work has dealt with innovative ways of addressing topics such as war, memory, identity, emotions, and strategies for persuasion in the ancient world. And this evening, Angelos' title is The Fear of God and Emotion and Its Context.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. One may as well say that the fear of God has brought you here, as the title of my lecture. In one of the stories of Mr. Koiner, Bertolt Brecht has someone ask Mr. Koiner if there is a God. I quote, Mr. K said, "I advise you to consider whether your behavior will change depending on the answer to this question. If it would change, then if it would not change, then we can just drop the question. But if it would change, then I can at least help you insofar as I can tell you that you have already decided the case. You need a God." End of quotation. Without using the word fear, Bertolt Brecht addresses one of the explanations of the belief in a divine power or in divine powers, the belief that human actions are observed and judged by superior powers that can inflict punishment for crimes and moral transgressions. This idea had already been expressed in classical Greece. In late 5th century Athens, the sophist Critias, Plato's uncle and leader of the oligarchic regime of the 30, presented in his satyr play Sisyphus the following scenario of how the belief in gods came about. In the earliest times, the mortals used to live like animals, subdued to the power of the mightiest among them. They neither knew the punishment of the evil man nor the reward of the virtues. It was only at a later stage that they developed laws, but again, only open deeds of violence could be punished. In order to deter the secret offenders as well, a clever Dick invented the gods. Our main source is a passage in Sextus Empiricus, a philosopher living in Athens around 200 CE. I'm sorry that I have to quote a passage from a work called Against the Mathematicians at the Institute for Advanced Study of all places, but I have no choice. Sextus Empiricus, I quote, says, "When the laws prevented men from open deeds of violence, but they continued to commit them in secret, I believe that a man of shrewd and subtle mind invented for men the fear of the gods, so that there might be something to frighten the wicked, even if they acted, spoke, or thought in secret. From this motive, he introduced the conception of divinity. There is, he said, a spirit enjoying endless life, hearing and seeing with his mind, exceedingly wise and all-observing, bearer of a divine nature. For a dwelling, he gave them the place whose mention would most powerful strike the hearers of men, whence, as he knew, fear come to mortals and help for their wretched lives. That is, the vault above, where he perceived the lightning and the dread roars of thunder, and the starry face and form of heaven fair wrought by the cunning craftsmanship of time. With such fears did he surround mankind, and so by his story give the good head a fair home in a fitting place, and extinguishing lawlessness by his ordinance. So I think, first of all, did someone persuade men to believe that there exists a race of gods. End of quotation. Not so many Greek thinkers were as bold as Critias to directly and openly instrumentalize religion by associating the creation of belief in gods with the hope of a more effective implementation of justice. And not so many intellectuals in history would claim that an emotion, in this case the fear of divine power, was the invention of a certain individual. Emotions are not invented. They are generated by neurobiological processes. But they also consist in a process of appraisal and individual judgment, which depends on social and cultural norms. As emotions heavily influence the behavior of individuals and groups, they are socially relevant and consequently subject to scrutiny, judgment, and normative intervention. As a social phenomenon, emotions fulfill social functions and follow social rules. And as such, they are potentially subject to change and are shaped by the society in which they operate. From simple recommendations prescribing emotions, such as, for instance, men don't cry, to legal interventions, such as, for instance, amnesty, and from training methods for restraining anger, to philosophical and religious teachings concerning desire, hope, or compassion, emotions are continually subject to conscious social interventions, but also to influences of cultural changes beyond the control of social agents. Emotions are not invented, but they are, up to a certain extent, constructed. Their evolution responds to changes in society and culture. It is for this reason that emotions are and should be an important subject of historical research. How emotions were constructed by society and culture is the subject of a project directed by me based in Oxford, funded by the European Research Council with a sum of more than $2 million. I have selected the subject of this lecture because it exemplifies how emotions can be subject of historical research, what ancient historians do when they say that they study emotions, and how the study of emotions can contribute to the understanding of society and culture. I have intentionally selected a subject that at first sight seems trivial: the fear of God. Do we really need $2 million of European taxpayers' money in order to understand a phenomenon which is widely attested in religions in antiquity and in the present? When people are confronted with something beyond their control and their understanding, they will be afraid. When people experience loss, they will be sad. When people observe someone in possession of what they lack, they will feel envy. When women are cheated by their husbands, they will be angry. They may not kill the children, as Medea did, although this is known to have happened, but they may throw a vase to the head of their husband. What can the historian study beyond universal and trivial responses to external stimuli? As will become clear from this presentation, the ancient historians study the parameters that determine the way emotions and feelings are represented in text and images. They study the way emotions are described, theatrically displayed, aroused, controlled, evaluated, exploited in persuasion strategies. They study the contexts in which emotions are embedded, they study the media of communication, and they study emotional communities. In my lecture, I will first determine the position of fear in Greek religion. Then I will explain through which media this fear was aroused. I will show how understanding The construction of fear contributes to the understanding of text and images. And finally, and very briefly, I will address the question of how this can lead to a fruitful dialogue between the humanities and the neurosciences. Sometime in the late 2nd century CE, the inhabitants of Daokometae, a small village near the Phrygian city of Aizanoi, set up an altar for the worship of Zeus. The short text on the altar reports, I quote, "The Daokometae in fulfillment of a vow. On the 19th of the month Laos, Menophilos was taken by dreadful fear, and the cult of great Zeus of Menophilos was founded." End of quotation. We will never know what had caused Menophilos' fear and made him establish the cult of Zeus, the great Zeus of Menophilos. Was it a divine epiphany, a miracle? Was it a vision? Was he struck by Zeus's lightning and survived? Or was he perhaps a repentant victim of divine punishment? If these questions must remain unanswered, this inscription still epitomizes essential features of religion in ancient Greece and in the rural areas of the Hellenized East. This is my definition of Greek religion. Religion is belief in the power of gods, but a belief which is based on experience, and a belief which is enhanced through rituals. Menophilos' experience of fear made him recognize the presence of God and exclaim, "Zeus is great." By establishing a cult, probably consisting in the offering of a sacrifice on the 19th of the month of Laos on this altar, Menophilos transmitted his personal experience and his belief to the other villagers. The permanence of this ritual strengthened the belief in divine power. We often observe this same interplay between emotional experience, religious belief, and ritual in ancient sources. In Philostratus' Heroikos, a fictional dialogue between a Thracian vine dresser and a Phoenician merchant, the Phoenician expresses his disbelief in the heroes of the Trojan War and their powers. More generally, he refuses to believe in tales that are not supported by personal experience. But then the vine dresser presents evidence and concludes, I quote, "For the sanctuary there, in Thessaly, is effective on behalf of Protesilaus, one of the heroes of the Trojan War, and it gives the Thessalians many signs, both kind and benevolent, but also angry, or gila, if he is neglected." It is only then that the Phoenician exclaims, "By Protesilaus, I believe you, Peithomai, vine dresser, as I recognize it is a good thing to swear by such a hero." The experience, we have again emotional experience on the one hand, belief and ritual. The experiences of the vine dresser and the Thessalians, experiences that include signs of divine anger, make the Phoenician merchant believe, Peithomai, and the very first manifestation of his belief is a ritual. He swears by the name of the hero. From the world of fiction, we now move to the world of reality. To the Sanctuary of Asclepius in Epidaurus, hundreds of pilgrims came here to experience cure from disease. After they had been purified, they slept in a long room called Abaton, which is shown in this slide, expecting the god to appear in their dream and cure them. In the late 4th century BC, the priests set up some stone inscriptions which narrated the healing miracles of the god. Several of them deal with disbelievers in Asclepius' healing powers or with individuals who thought that they could cheat the god and deprive him of his reward. But then the god reveals his power, usually in the form of punishment, restoring belief in his power, restoring belief in his power. This belief is then publicly expressed through a ritual. The narrative of a fishmonger who had neglected his promise to dedicate to Asclepius a tithe from his profit is a good example. When the fishmonger was in the market, his fish was struck by lightning. I quote, "While a big crowd was standing around to watch," it is important to notice here that there is a crowd, that there are other people who also experience the miracle of God. While a big crowd was standing around to watch, Amphimnastos, this is the fishmonger, confessed the whole fraud that he had committed against Asclepius. But after he had entreated the god the god made the fish alive and fresh, and Athymnastos, this is my addition, dedicated the tithe to Asclepius. End of quotation. Divine punishment restored the man's belief in divine power and made him perform two rituals, prayer and dedication. I hope that these examples show the importance of experience, indeed of emotional experience and ritual, for the belief in divine powers. In Greece and in the areas that were Hellenized after Alexander the Great's conquests, religious belief beyond the circles of the intellectuals was intrinsically connected with experiences that were attributed to divine intervention. These experiences justified both fear and hope, as it was exclusively in the discretion of a god to punish or to forgive, to listen to a prayer or to ignore it, to come when he is invited or to stay away. The fundamental emotion of the mortal who approached the god was fear, which of course does not exclude hope. Some gods should be feared more than others. Pan did not give his name to panic for no reason. A Cretan, probably a mercenary with some poetic talent, dedicated a statue of Pan, expressing in the epigram the intrinsic fear in the encounters of humans with this god. I quote, "Who can approach you without fear, even if he is bringing you sacrificial animals?" Usually, mortals approach the gods with hope. In their acclamations and prayers, they addressed a god with epithets that expressed their expectations, that the god listens to prayers, that he is epekos, that he is willing to manifest his power, that he is epiphanes, that he is continually present, endemos and epidemos, that he offers protection, that he is soter, asphaleios, apotropaios, that he is donor of good things. But where is hope, there is also fear, fear of disappointment, of failure, of rejection. Perhaps the best expression of these ambiguous feelings in the encounter between mortals and gods is the use of the verb tharein or tharsein, have courage. The imperative tharsei, take courage, is an expression regularly used by gods when addressing mortals. The imperative of courage presupposes the reality of fear, fear of the unknown, of the future, of a god's unpredictable reaction. One of the miracles narrated in an inscription from Lindos, which aimed at glorifying the local goddess Athena, Lindia, and her sanctuary on Rhodes, describes how the Lindians were in despair because of shortage of water during a siege of their city by the Persians. While they were considering surrender, Athena appeared in the dream of one of the magistrates and urged him not to be afraid, tharsein, for she herself would request from her father Zeus the water that they so urgently needed. It was the prerogative of a god to remove the fear of an impeding danger. This situation is described by the poet Isilos, who narrates his encounter as a sick boy with Asclepius, who was on his way to save Sparta from a Macedonian attack. I quote again, Isilos requested the god's mercy, and Asclepius responded, "Have courage, tharsei, for I shall come to you in due time." The vocabulary used in this encounter, to entreat someone, to feel mercy, clearly expresses the asymmetry in the relationship between petitioning mortal and granting God. A benevolent God may give courage precisely because he understands that the predominant emotion of the mortal is fear. Who can approach the divinity without fear? Only the pious men and women. During the initiation in the mysteries of Isis, a priest gave courage to the initiates. I quote again, "Have courage, initiates, now that the god has been saved, for we shall receive salvation from pains." Such piety, based on the emotional experience, heartened also an anonymous poet in Maroneia in Thrace who believed that he had been cured by Isis. In a praise of her powers, he invited the goddess to come and listen to his praise and expresses his conviction that the goddess will come. I quote, "Without fear, Tharon, I am now proceeding to the rest, knowing that this praise is written by mortal hands, but by a divine mind." The confidence of the pious is contrasted by the fear that the impious should feel. Priestly proclamations at the beginning of rituals encouraged some worshippers to attend without fear, and others who did not fulfill the requirement of purity and morality to stay away. Such proclamations are echoed by sacred regulations, such as a text again from Lindos on Rhodes, which concerns ritual purity. The regulation ends with a metrical text, certainly an oracle, urging those who are pure to enter the precinct of Athena without fear, tharaleos, and the impure ones to go away. The fear of divine punishment for crimes, violations of sacred regulations, impiety, or anything else that might cause the anger of gods was omnipresent in Greek culture, as was the belief that the gods' wrath falls upon innocent and guilty alike. This concept dictated collective actions of communities. Public curses repeatedly threaten the violator of laws with destructions not only of himself, but of his entire family and lineage. A decree of Iolkos in Thessaly reintroduced sacrifices to the heroes to prevent their anger if the service was neglected. And as late as the early 3rd century BC, the polis of Dodona was wondering whether the god had sent bad weather because of the impurity of some man. The fear of gods was continually endorsed by secular and religious authorities, intellectuals, or just by pious devotees. The phrase, "fear the gods," was indeed proverbial. Inscriptions from sanctuaries in Greece and Asia Minor, mainly of the Hellenistic and imperial periods, reveal some of the means by which the fear of God was constructed and transmitted: cult regulations, narrative of punitive miracles, and confession inscriptions. My first example is one of the longest sacred regulations, which sets the requirements for participation in the mysteries performed by a private cult association in Philadelphia. This is not a text on the screen, it is another text. It's very long to be included in the PowerPoint presentation. The founder of an association claimed that he had received ordinances for the performance of purifications and mysteries from Zeus in his sleep. I quote, "When coming into this house, let men and women, free people and slaves, swear by all the gods neither to know nor make use wittingly of any deceit against a man or a woman, neither poison harmful to men nor harmful spells." And it goes on. This list of restrictions is accompanied with blessings and threats. I quote again, "Whoever, woman or man, does any of the things written above, let him not enter this house. For great are the gods set up in it. They watch over these things and will not tolerate those who transgress the ordinances." End of quotation. Particular attention is paid to the adulteress. I assume that the founder of this cult was the victim of adultery. I quote, "Such a woman is not chaste, but defiled and full of endemic pollution, and unworthy to reverence this God whose holy things these are that have been set up. She is not to be present at the sacrifices, not to offend the purifications and cleansings, not to see the mysteries being performed. But if she does any of these things, from the time the ordinances have come on to this inscription, she shall have evil curses from the gods for disregarding these ordinances. For the God does not desire these things to happen at all, nor does he wish it, but he wants obedience. The gods will be gracious to those who obey, and always give them all good things, whatever gods give to men whom they love. But should any transgress, they shall hate such people and inflict upon them great punishments." End of quotation. This regulation is then endorsed through a ritual. I quote again, "At the monthly and annual sacrifices, may those men and women who have confidence in themselves touch this inscription on which the ordinances of the god have been written, in order that those who obey these ordinances and those who do not may be manifest." So by entering the sanctuary where this cult took place, you go to the inscription, you touch the inscription in a way, you take an oath that you are innocent, and then you enter the house. Before the worshippers were invited to touch this inscription, the text was certainly read aloud to them. The worshippers heard the long list of the gods whose altars were set up in the clubhouse. They heard the expression that these are great gods, which in this period signified power, efficacy, presence, visible holiness, and willingness to listen to the prayers of humans. An expression that also warned the sinners of the infallible justice of the gods. They heard the promise of blessing, and they heard the threat of punishment. This cult regulation is more detailed and direct than most similar texts, and thus it helps us understand the function of all cult regulations as performative text, that is, texts that were recited by the worshippers or the priests in order to arouse hope and fear. This is another example, a metrical regulation from Euromos in Caria, which expresses similar thoughts. I quote, "Stranger, if you have a pure heart, and if you exercise justice in your soul, then enter this sacred place. But if you are unjust and your mind is impure, then stay away from the immortals and from the Seder precinct. This sacred house does not like evil men and punishes them. To the holy, however, the God gives holy gifts." Not unlike the text from Philadelphia, which presented itself as a text directly given from a god, the text from Euromos seems to be an oracle. It was probably written on one of the doorposts of the temple to be read by the worshippers approaching the sacred place. What such cult regulations present only as a possibility, divine anger and prosecution, is presented as an accomplished punishment in narratives of punitive miracles of gods, to which I shall now turn. We have already seen a punitive miracle in Epidaurus, the miracle of the fishmonger. I do not have the time to discuss other inscriptions that narrate punitive miracles, but they are a quite common feature of the epigraphy of sanctuaries. The largest and best studied group of such texts are the so-called confession inscriptions. This term designates a group of texts from Asia Minor, particularly from Lydia and Phrygia in Anatolia, which contain the confession of various offenses, usually violations of ritual norms, records of the ritual acts with which the angry gods were propitiated, and exaltations of the divine power. The dedicators believed that an offense committed either by them or by relatives had angered a god who punished them with illness, accident, death, or destruction of the property. The relevant texts date from the 1st to the 3rd century CE. They were written on stone stelae, such as the ones that I saw on this slide, and set up in sanctuaries. These so-called confession inscriptions, which should more accurately be labeled records of divine punishment, combine elements of confession, propitiation, exaltation of the god, and dedication. Consequently, they share common features with other texts such as dedications, praises, and prayers. These records were more than just texts. They were connected with complex ritual actions. These inscriptions originate in individuals who thought that a god was inflicting punishment because they had committed, intentionally or not, a crime or violated a norm. In this difficult situation, they made vows to the gods and appealed to local sanctuaries, expecting the god to reveal the cause of his anger and the way by which atonement could be achieved. This was done by means of oracles, divine messengers, and dreams, and with the active assistance of priests who interpreted the signs of divine will. Presumably, after the priests had won some clues about possible transgressions, through discussions with their clients, so they worked more or less like modern psychoanalysts. They were discussing with the people who approached the sanctuary in order to find out what have they done to be persecuted by the god. After they did this, it was not difficult to determine offenses that had caused the anger of the gods. Some of these offenses are really trivial. For instance, going to a sanctuary with dirty clothes or throwing a stone in a sanctuary. This was then communicated to the worshippers in one of the confession inscriptions, the delinquent reports. "I suffered punishment because I was not ready for the ritual, and received the following oracular response: because you were not impure." Once the oracular response had given a hint about the possible cause of the divine wrath, the worshipper could identify the misdemeanor either by himself, by interrogating relatives, or through discussions with the priests. If not, he could still atone for known and unknown sins. This is also attested, ex eidoton, kai me eidoton, forgive me for everything that I have done knowingly or unknowingly. In their everyday conflicts, individuals who believed that they had been wronged sometimes also submitted their accusations to the priests, who then served as arbitrators, swore in the parties, or cursed the offenders in order to attract the interest of the gods to the offense. The offender was again expected to seek the assistance of priests in order to atone his misdemeanors. The atonement consisted in the erection of a stone with a confession, another dedication, in the payment of money to the sanctuaries, in rituals such as purification, the praise of the gods, and in dedications. A few selected inscriptions shall illustrate the impact of such monuments on the emotions of the visitors of sanctuaries. The first text is from Collida and narrates in a very syncopated form the sins of two brothers who prevented their father from propitiating the gods. A fragmentary relief seems to represent a man being killed by an animal. The representation is unfortunately fragmentary, but you recognize a man who has fallen on his knees. He's attacked by a wild animal on the right hand, and probably either a rock has fallen on him or he's holding a shield. It is not clear. At any rate, this is what happened to him because he was punished by the god. I quote now the inscription. Ammianos and Hermogenes, the sons of Tryphon, appeared at the sanctuary, asking the gods Men Motilitis and Zeus Sabazios and Artemis Anaitis and the great Senate and the council of the gods, asking also the village and the sacred Dumos, the sacred cult association, in order that they may find mercy. For they have been punished because they seized their father while he was acknowledging the powers of the gods. Oops, no, this is the next one. And their father did not obtain pity, but after his death they wrote an account of his first written declaration, nobody at any time should disparage the gods, and dedicated the stele praising the gods. End of quotation. What happened? It seems that Tryphon, the father, was about to make a confession of a sin, probably after having been punished by the gods, but he was held back by his sons. As his reconciliation with the gods was denied to him, he met with a violent death, what is depicted on the stone. Then the wrath of the gods fell on the sons until they were forced to come to the sanctuary, confess their sin, and put an end to the punishment. Their question was addressed to three particular gods, very popular in this region: the Iranian moon god Mes, whose sanctuary was at Motila, Zeus Zabazios, and Artemis, associated with the Persian goddess Anahita. Their case was also presented to a council of gods, which is sometimes mentioned in confession inscriptions as a divine court. But this affair was not only a matter between the sinners and the gods through the mediation of priests. The whole village and the religious association were also involved and present as audience, possibly as witnesses and advisors. The reconciliation of the two men with the gods was achieved when they erected the stele, the stone, with a confession and a quite unambiguous visual message. They praised the gods, probably in the usual form of acclamations, and they quoted a written statement of their father, which would serve as a warning to others. Nobody at any time should disparage the gods. The praise of the gods, which here is only mentioned, is more evident in another record of divine punishment from Lydia, the next text. I quote, "Great is the mother of Mes Axiotenos. Glycon, the son of Apollonios, and Myrtion, the wife of Apollonios, set up this praise for Mes Uranios and for Mes of Artemidoros, who rules over Axiota, for the rescue and for that of the children. For you, Lord, have shown mercy when I was a captive. Great is your holiness. Great is your justice. Great is your victory. Great your punishing power. Great is the Dodecatheon, the 12 gods, that have been established in your vicinity. For the son of my brother Deminatos made me his captive. For I had neglected my own affairs and helped you, as if you were my own son. But you locked me in and kept me a captive, as if I were a criminal and not your uncle. Now great is Mes, the ruler over Axiota. You have given me satisfaction. I praise you." End of quotation. This text consists of acclamations and an account given by Glycon in a sanctuary in the presence of an audience. Glycon had been locked up by his nephew, probably in the course of a family quarrel. After an incident interpreted by the nephew as divine punishment, Glycon was set free, came to the sanctuary, accompanied by his nephew, presented his accusations in an emotional manner, pointing to the nephew's ingratitude and praising the god. Presumably, Glycon's dedication and praise was accompanied by the nephew's propitiation of the god according to the manner often described in confession inscriptions. We may assume that the acclamations recorded in this text were repeated during the erection of the stone. The third example is connected with the transmission of oracular responses of the gods to the sinners by the priest. Theodoros, a sacred slave at Silandos, had repeatedly violated the obligation of sexual abstinence and had even committed adultery. When his sight was afflicted, this is indicated by the two eyes that you recognize on the stone, and next to the stone there is a crescent moon, which is the symbol of the god Mes, the Iranian moon god. When his sight was afflicted, he went to the sanctuary. There he may have been kept in custody, possibly not as punishment, but as a result of his affliction, the fact that he could not see, and he received instructions concerning the rituals through which he could propitiate Mes, the god who had punished him. A crescent moon and a pair of eyes, as I said, represented on the stele, allude to the punishing god and the affliction. The text does not give a continuous narrative of the events, but presents confessions of Theodoros, divine utterances, and ritual instructions. The utterances of the gods and the instructions were probably given by the priests who impersonated the gods. With Zeus's assistance, the council of gods in a heavenly court entreated Mes to forgive Theodoros. I read the text. "For I have been brought by the gods to my senses, by Zeus and the great Mes Artemidoru." Then Mes, the god, speaks. "I have punished Theodoros on his eyes for his offenses." Theodoros confesses. "I had sexual intercourse with Trophime, the slave of Haplocomas, the wife of Eutychis, in the praetorium." He takes the first sin away with a sheep, a partridge, a mole. Second sin, Theodoros speaks again. "While I was a slave of the gods of Nonos, I had sexual intercourse with the flautist Ariadne." He takes away with a piglet, a tuna, another fish. Theodoros, "On my third sin, I had sexual intercourse with the flautist Aretusa," so he had a particular preference to musicians. He takes away with a chicken, a sparrow, a pigeon, a kypros of barley and wheat, a prochus of wine, and so on. Theodoros, "I asked for Zeus's assistance." The god answers, "See, I have blinded him for his sins. But since he has appeased the gods and has erected the stele, he has taken his sins away. Asked by the council of the gods, I respond that I am kindly disposed if he sets up my stele on the day I have ordered. You may open the prison. I set the convict free after 1 year and 10 months. End of quotation. The ritual described in this text is labeled in other texts as triphonon, a triad of animals, or enneaphonon, 3 triads of animals. It seems to be a specific local ritual expressed with Greek terms. The triads of animals probably represented elements such as the earth, the sky, the underworld, and the water. The object of the verb to take away is explicitly stated. It is the sin. The ritual transmission of the sin to animals recalls scapegoat rituals, but also finds parallels in Hittite rituals. Such rituals included the release of animals to remove evil and sins, followed by incantations. The sin described in this text must have taken place in a sanctuary or a temple in front of the images of the divinities. The importance of the sanctuary as the stage of the rituals of confessions and praises is also clear in one of the most detailed inscriptions, which concerns the conflict between a woman, Tatias, and her village. I quote, "Since Jucundus was struck by insanity, and it was rumored by everybody that he had been given a potion or poison by his mother-in-law Tatias. Tatias set up a scepter and deposited imprecations in the temple as defending herself against an imputation, although she was conscious of her guilt. For this reason, the gods exercised a punishment which she did not escape. Similarly, her son Socrates, when he was passing by the entrance which leads to the grove, having a sickle in his hands, with which one cuts down vines, the sickle fell on his foot, and thus he suffered punishment within a day and died. The gods of Azita are great. They demanded that the scepter and the imprecations made in the temple be annullated. Socrateia, Moschas, Jucundus, and Menecrates, the children of Jucundus and Moschion, and grandchildren of Tatias, annullated this, atoning in every way the gods. Having reported the power of the gods on Estili, we praise the gods from now on." End of quotation. In order to defend her honor and free herself from slander, Tatias went to the sanctuary and cursed her accusers. Tatias's ritual actions were performed in public, in the temple, the most prominent public space of a small community, possibly on the day of a festival. The ceremony consisted in the erection of a scepter, the symbol of the god. The scepter is a common attribute of the god Mes in the reliefs that decorate the stelae with such confessions. The erection of the scepter was presumably conducted by the priests who mentioned the case for which the scepter was set up and invoked the particular god whose scepter was erected and who was expected to punish the culprit. The presence of an audience in this phase was as important both as form of social control and as witness of divine power. My last example is a record of a divine punishment of a thief who ignored the preventive cursing of those who commit theft in a public bath. The god punished him and forced him to confess his crime and deliver the garment he had stolen. The story is narrated in the text, and in the image you see the god, the punishing god Mes, and underneath you see a person with raised hands bringing the cloak that he had stolen to the sanctuary. It is time to come to some general conclusions and observations. The part played by emotions in the few texts that I have selected for this presentation is quite evident. The confession inscriptions continually describe or allude to emotions: fear, hope, shame, honor, and anger. The common denominator is the fear of gods. The fear of divine punishment is explicitly stated in the cult regulations, for instance in the text from Philadelphia. It is described in narratives of punitive miracles. It is the background of the confession inscriptions. In order to understand how these inscriptions aroused emotions, we should look to the main features. These inscriptions are at the same time texts, they are monuments, they are exempla, and they are media of ritual actions. As texts, they are the product of selection and elaborate composition. They contain a narrative part, they tell a story, but they also quote performative texts, acclamations. The phrase, Thei ihydritai megai, great gods have been established here in the text from Philadelphia, quotes the common acclamation megas theos, great gods, and such acclamations are continually quoted in confession inscriptions. Religious acclamations were an important medium of communication. They gave public testimony to the power of God and confirmed the worshippers' faith. They propitiated the god after a misdemeanor and warned others. They expressed solidarity and identity. Such texts fulfilled their function only when they were read, and there are indications that they were not simply read, but they were recited during rituals. These texts are also monuments. They were set up in prominent places of sanctuaries. The cult regulations were to be found at the entrance of the temenos, the precinct, or the temple. Often decorated with images, they immediately attracted the attention of the visitors of the sanctuaries and fulfilled a commemorative function. As exempla, they provided instruction. The confession inscriptions were set up as exemplum, this is the word that is used in this text, as proof, martyrion, as attestation, as testimony of the effectiveness of divine justice. They urged the viewers and readers to interpret the small and big problems that occurred in everyday life as punishment for their offenses. The oral praise of the gods was a very effective but nevertheless ephemeral means of attracting the attention of the pilgrims to the divine power. It was the erection of a stone inscription that made this ephemeral ritual into a perpetual exemplum for others. No manifestation of divine power counts if there are no persons to testify to it. The very word for manifestation of divine power, epiphaneia, epiphany, underlines the visibility of the miracle. The gods expected from the mortals who have experienced their power, both the euergetic and the destructive, to tell others about it, to write hymns and aretalogies, to set up inscriptions with narratives for others to read. A confession inscription of a woman who had been raped by a certain Agathemeros reveals the close connection of the erection of the stele and the pronouncement of instructions. At the end, it ends with an instruction, for he has set up a stele instructing the others not to neglect the god. The context of these inscriptions are the ritual practices in the sanctuaries. Some of these texts were set up during rituals, others were read during rituals. For instance, the inscription from Philadelphia, which I quoted before, was part of a ritual. The reason that I insist on the connection of this text with rituals is because rituals are emotionally loaded activities performed by groups of individuals interacting with one another. Consequently, their emotional impact is substantially greater than that of texts that are read in isolation in an emotionally neutral space. We need to bear this in mind in order to understand the impact of this text and images in arousing emotions. I have repeatedly pointed to the fact that the reading of this text often presupposes audiences. More importantly, most of the inscriptions of the categories that I treated today became the focal point of attention during celebrations. This is when cult regulations were read aloud. This is when many worshippers came to the sanctuaries and saw the images and read the texts. Both the acclamation at the beginning and the reference to the continual praise reflect rituals performed in the sanctuaries and occasionally depicted in the reliefs that decorated these inscriptions. Worshippers are represented standing with a right hand raised. In one case, a man touches or holds the scepter of a god. In another, a woman brings her right hand to the breast in a gesture of adoration. In another case, a woman is represented falling on her knees, probably in front of the statue of the gods. It is this combination of narrative, performance, ritual, and image that brought past experiences and narratives of manifestations of divine power that made the inscriptions to an effective medium for the arousal of the emotion of fear, for the construction of the fear of gods. If we would ask someone who has never seen a movie to describe these images, he would say that they show a young woman taking a shower and enjoying it. If we were asked to describe this image, the image of mess, we would say that it shows the statue of a young male god with a Phrygian cup holding a staff or a scepter. The answer to the question, what this is, would be that it is the last letter of the alphabet. Very few might say that it is the title of a French movie by Costa Gavras. A few more might associate it with the sign of Zorro. For a classicist, the text Megas Theos, great God, is an acclamation, that expresses the power of a god. All these answers to my questions are correct, but all of them disregard the emotional background and the emotional impact of text and images that are embedded in experiences and narratives. We all know that this image is not that of a young woman taking a shower, but the icon of horror. It is the image of a woman about to be murdered. For a Greek in the 60s or 70s, zeta is not the last letter of the alphabet, but the symbol of a movement that led to the collapse of Karamanlis' government in 1963 and his exile to Paris, the symbol of Greek youth in the 60s. Similarly, this is not just the image of mess, but the icon of divine power, which can be protective and destructive, punishing and forgiving. Megas Theos, great God, is not a text, but an emotional affirmation of belief in the power of God. The emotional background in this text and images the emotional background in which these texts and images were embedded allows us to properly understand them as acoustic and visual signals, aiming to arouse emotions. As acoustic and visual signals, texts and images are more than what they mean or show, exactly as the word Ausländer in German or liberal in US English have emotional connotations that go far beyond the literal meaning of the words, exactly because they are embedded in experiences. Texts and images set up in sanctuaries had a meaning that was activated during rituals and became effective in the presence of audiences and during the performance of rituals, during collective actions. The fear of gods, which goes hand in hand with the hope of divine protection, was constructed and transmitted through images and text which can be fully understood only if studied in contexts. The reconstruction of this emotional context is the great challenge for the ancient historian, but it is also a necessary condition for the understanding of texts and images. This approach allows us to understand the communities of worshippers as emotional communities, and the rituals as media through which particular emotions were enhanced. Religions always invest in emotions. The differences between religions and cults are to a great extent connected with differences in the emotions which they promote. The communities of worshippers of mystery cults, based on the belief in the love of a benevolent God for mankind, are different emotional communities than the community of the citizens who proudly celebrate a local god. And this again is different than the community of the Christians or the Jews. One of the greatest authors of classical antiquity clearly observed the importance of emotion in the creation of communities of worshippers. This author is Lucian. In his work, Alexander or the False Prophet, he narrates with satirical overtones and exaggerations the true story of the creation of a new religion, the cult of the snake god Glycon Neos Asclepios, Glycon the sweet one, the new Asclepios, a god who healed, gave oracles, and promised relief from reincarnation. This is how Lucian explains the motives of Alexander, the prophet, and his companion for the introduction of the new cult. They readily understood that human life is ruled by two great tyrants, hope and fear, and that a man who could use both of these to advantage would speedily enrich himself. For they perceive that both to one who fears and to one who hopes, for knowledge is very essential and very keenly coveted. Thanks to these two tyrants, hope and fear, men continually visited the sanctuaries and sought to learn the future in advance, and to that end sacrificed hecatombs and dedicated ingots of gold. End of quotation. One of the most fascinating recent developments in neuroscience, enhanced through developments in neuroimaging, is the study of the interdependence between emotion, attention, memory, cognition, and reasoning. Ray Dolan writes in an article in Science, which was published incidentally on my birthday, I quote, "Emotion exerts a powerful influence on reason and in ways neither understood nor systematically researched contributes to the fixation of belief. Perhaps there is not much that ancient history can do to change this, but I hope that the evidence that I presented here at least shows that this interdependence between emotion, memory, and cognition is evident in the source material and nicely epitomized in the last text of my presentation. I quote, "There is a goddess of retribution. Therefore, pay attention to justice." Commemoration of divine punishment attracted the attention of the worshippers. It aroused their emotions, leading to cognition and reasoning. Remember the punishment of others, feel fear, and therefore act justly. Thank you very much for your attention. So, there is a possibility to ask questions if you wish, to make observations, or yes. There is a microphone which is necessary before you ask your question.
Thank you very much. My question is the following. You set up the emotion of fear within the religious context you're studying as going hand in hand with the hope of divine protection, hand in hand with submission, hand in hand with the assumption or presumption of divine moral perfection, and so on and so forth. The critics, okay, are ridiculing this, setting it up as, cynically, instrumentally. Now, my question is, do we get in this culture anything akin to the combination of fear and confrontation, which, say, in the Old Testament we get it to at least two moments, like Abraham confronting God's judgment about Sodom and Gomorrah, and the book of Job, of course. In both cases, it's not cynical, it's not instrumental, it's not a critique of religiosity. These are highly charged religious moments. Both men are trembling in the face of God in their boots, and yet these are not moments of submission or hope for protection, but rather angry moments of confronting divine moral imperfection, if you wish. Do we have anything parallel to that in the Greek religiosity you study? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. We do have something like that, especially in the criticism of religion in late 5th century Athens, especially in Euripides, who very often questions not just the rituals of humans, but also the commands of gods. Let me give you one example. In Ion, one of his tragedies, he addresses the question of supplication, the fact that people just touch an altar and are regarded as immune. And he, I don't have the exact verses in my memory, but more or less what he says is that divine judgments of this type are wrong, because only the just should seek supplication in the altar. And there is a general trend which starts probably in the early 5th or perhaps in the late 6th century BC and continues until the 4th century, which is to change the automatism of ritual into justification. Let me give you 3 examples, and all these examples, I think, have a common denominator, which is to question the traditional belief that by doing certain things, regardless of morality, judgment, justification, and so on, you are going to achieve the same result. Like an ATM machine, you press the right buttons, you get the right result, you get money. It is a criticism of cursing, that only justified curses are going to be effective. This is the development of a type of curses called prayers for justice. In the traditional curses, you just give the names of the people you don't like, you use the right words, and they're going to die. In the prayers of justice, you explain why you need the god to intervene and punish them. The second development is purity. And I have already quoted a couple of texts that suggest this. This is the idea that purity is the purity of the heart and not the purity of the body. And it is interesting that the earliest reference to this is in a sanctuary, the sanctuary of Epidaros, of Asclepius. The temple inscription says, when you enter this temple which smells of incense, you should enter it with in purity, and purity means to be pure in your mind. This is an oracle of Apollo, which at the same time criticizes, the god criticizes all the other cults in which you enter the sanctuaries just by washing your hands, and not by presenting yourself with a pure heart. The third development is the asylum, the justification of supplication. You do not just perform the ritual action, touching the altar and becoming immune, but needing to justify why you are seeking divine protection. And the fourth area where you can find this is in mystery cults. In the original concept of a mystery, you just initiate yourself in a cult, and then you expect salvation in afterlife. And we observe in the course of the classical period, and especially in the Hellenistic period, a movement towards the notion of piety. It is not just performing certain rituals that will save you, but a change of attitude. This is one of the examples in which one can see a criticism, religion, and also in some cases indication of a criticism of particular cults. It is a competition of cults. It is not someone questioning his own religion in quotation mark, or his own cult, but someone trying through this criticism to show the weakness of another cult. I hope that my answers to other questions are going to be shorter, but this was, of course, a very big issue. Other questions? Please. Wait for the microphone.
Absolutely, parenthetically, first of all, thank you for this marvelous presentation of context and content. I just want to parenthetically suggest that the stele itself is part of the message. The stele is a particular monumental type that conveys the notion of an important public announcement. Various kinds, of course, but in this case, the content that you're talking about. It's a little, you know, I find it a little bit like the badge of a police officer that by its very shape, by its very existence, incites at least attention, maybe even fear, in the sense that you're talking about.
Yeah, you are absolutely right, and this, what you said, is endorsed by the terminology that we find in these confession inscriptions, the term stellographein. Not just to write something, but to write it on a stele. Not to write it anywhere, but to write it in this emblematic type of monument, which is set up in the sanctuary and is immediately watched. It is really a pity that almost, if I'm not wrong, not a single confession inscription has been found in context. They are found in Swiss antiquarian stores, they are found in the antiquities market, and so on. This is a disaster. Just imagine how much more we would win from this text if we also knew their arrangement in space, in situ, in the sanctuaries that have not been systematically excavated, but systematically looted. Other questions? Yes.
It's probably two connected questions. One is, the more general one would be, what is the relationship, I guess in that period, between fear of God and generally religion's relationship with gods and witchcraft?
With what?
And witchcraft.
Witchcraft.
What is the relationship between piety and witchcraft, if you want? And the second one is that in Hellenic, at least mythology, we definitely know of other types of encounters between humans and gods, which usually led to some progeny which was considered to belong to the god. And so that would presumably be not so fear-related. So how does that get into the picture? Or maybe it has changed by the time which you're talking about.
Yeah, well, to briefly address the second, because both of your questions are the subject of huge lectures where I'm not going to give. The discussion of religion in myth is a subject in itself, because it is connected with traditions that go beyond the historical context with which I am concerned. These are narratives that were created in periods about which we know a little, sometimes only next to nothing. They are transmitted traditionally, and they are reinterpreted in a different context. This is the methodological question, a very important methodological issue, and in my own study of religion, cults, and religious mentality, I focus on periods in which we can really place evidence in context. This is why I would prefer not to go into depth into the discussion of the myth. The first question is equally monumental. The relationship between religion and magic is a subject about which many books have been written without reaching any conclusion. It depends on what one means with magic or witchcraft in ancient Greece. Witchcraft, in the sense of black magic, that is to perform certain rituals in order to harm people, is something that is not connected with the public religion. It is associated with gods of the underworld. There are only particular gods that you invoke when you wish someone to die or to suffer. There are, however, aspects of cursing, for instance, that are very closely associated with public religion. For instance, when you take an oath, and an oath is a public ritual, at the same time you curse yourself. In case you violate your oath, or in case you are not telling the truth, you are going to punish by the gods. You invoke the gods. So if one needs to separate these two aspects, that is, magical activities, such as public cursing, that are part of an official religion in which priests officiate, and magic, witchcraft, as a separate activity which is outside the cult, which is under the control of the community. It is not done by priests. It is done by different ritual experts who are not part of the official representatives of the community. So these are two different phenomena. These phenomena sometimes converge in some of the texts that I have presented in this lecture. For instance, in the confession inscriptions, we do have forms of public cursing. For instance, the setting up of the scepter is cursing. You curse a culprit whom you do not know in order to force him to confess his sin, because he will experience punishment, and sooner or later something happens to anyone, and then you attribute it to the divine punishment and you go to the sanctuary. But this is different from witchcraft, which is also mentioned in this text. For instance, the accusation that Tatias poisoned her son-in-law and made him crazy. This is an entirely different ritual. John, again the microphone.
If we could return to the three victim sacrifices of the adulterer, was his name Theodoros?
Theodoros, yes.
Theodoros. It would seem that the sacrifice of the birds on an academic...
We don't know whether it is sacrifice. It is that he removed his sin through that. And we don't know whether it is sacrifice or just letting them go away. It's, but anyway, yeah.
Because the economic value of the last three, the bird or the bird offerings, or whatever they were, would seem so much less than the mammal. The first three were
sheep, mole, and partridge, and then you have three types of fish, and then you have three types of bird. So I think that their symbolical value is as representatives of the sky, the earth, and the water.
So this is very different from sacrifice.
It's very different, yeah. And I think that the closest parallels are not found in Greek religion, but in Hittite ritual. So it is a ritual of transmitting sin, problems, and so on animals. In the Hittite rituals, these animals are just led away. Sometimes they are just left to go to the territory of the enemy. This is a very good thing to do, to get rid of them and let them carry the pollution and the sin and the disease and so on into the territory of the enemy. So it's cannot be exactly compared with sacrificial rituals.
Thank you.
Yes. So I have 1, 2, or yeah.
I'm sure good things happen to bad people, and bad things happen to good people at that time. Certainly true today. How do you think they rationalize that, and how do they continue to believe in a God or a God or the gods when those things happen?
Yes, a very good question, and there is a good answer. And this is the fact that the punishment can be transmitted to the next generation. So, and this is an observation that already made. It made some people to atheists. For instance, Diogenes, not the cynic philosopher, but another one in the 5th century, this is the reason why he stopped believing in gods, because he's someone who wronged him, was thriving, whereas he was not. In that case, you just expect that if the culprit is not going to be punished, then this is going to happen to his sons, to his grandchildren, and so on, or, and this is the second possibility, after death. There is life after death, and this is the possibility for the good ones to have eternal blessing and for the bad ones to have eternal punishment. So this was certainly something that was observed and was part of the discourse. And this was also part of the criticism. There is a joke, for instance, narrated in a poem by Babrius. A farmer loses his agricultural implement. There is no way to find the guilty part, and this is also part of an answer to the question of Menahem before. So what you do, you go to the sanctuary, bringing all your neighbors together and have them swear that they have not stolen your property. While he's approaching the sanctuary, he listens to a herald announcing that the priest is going to give a reward of 1,000 drachmas to whoever finds someone who had stolen the property of the god. And the poor farmer says, well, if the god cannot even protect his property, how he's going to find mine? So this is something that people continually observe, this discrepancy between the expectation of divine punishment and the presence of divine power and the reality. Another, and this becomes very, very obvious in the Hellenistic period. One of the most important ritual texts that we have from this period is a hymn for a Hellenistic king, Demetrius the Besieger. What is stated in this poem is exactly this, is addressing exactly this problem. Why aren't the gods intervening when we need them? And again, I quote from this poem, they say, not the other gods are far away, or they don't have ears, or they don't care, or they do not exist. But you are here present, not made of stone or bronze, so save us. This is another response exactly to this question. If you do not expect assistance from the gods, then get it from whoever may give it, and this is one of the reasons for the deification of rulers in the Hellenistic period and in later times. Your question.
Greek culture certainly occupies a very lofty position in the cultural hierarchy, and Hellenism certainly was one of the more successful forces in civilization. So my question is, to what extent would you attribute any of the religious construct that you have outlined here today as being a driver behind those successes, or to what degree is it relevant to it, particularly considering any number of other cultures, some of which you've named, which have very similar constructs and yet don't seem to quite have accomplish quite so much or have, you know, such a tremendous offering?
Yeah. This is, again, a very good question, would require a substantially longer talk. This is something that I would like to address in this presentation. And thank you for your question, because it gives me the opportunity to make something clear. I was referring to Greek gods, adding always, and the Hellenized East, in order to make clear what I mean with Greek world is an area which was dominated, conquered, controlled by the Greeks. This doesn't necessarily mean that the phenomena that I presented here are exclusively Greek phenomena. The Greeks never lived in absolute isolation, not even in the classical period, in which mobility was not as intense as in the Hellenistic period. They did this, and there is a lot of evidence that a lot of the phenomena that I'm discussing here were influenced by Judaism, by Egyptian religion, by local religions, and so on. So this is not something specifically Greek or Hellenistic.
Thank you. Let me repeat my invitation to all come and continue the discussion in the Ford Hall Common Room. But before we do that, let us thank Angelos again for an extremely interesting talk.